River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm here today because I asked a question of the Minister about a woman in my riding named Pat. Now, Pat is now 80 and was desperately ill, and in fact, her family was uncertain of how long she would be with us. The good news is Pat got better. The bad news is during her time of having a hard health issue, she did not have a home anymore. So the reality is for Pat that she was told by the hospital that she would have to leave. She had nowhere to go and ended up spending months in a hotel where the rent there was $500 a week, much more than the pension that she had. And so when we look at the reality of seniors across Canada that are facing the same challenges that Pat is, we want to make sure that they have a safe place to go, that seniors are not homeless and put in this situation. I think that it's important to recognize that in our communities and the communities that I represent in North Island Powell River, there are a lot of organizations working hard every day to address issues of homelessness and the high risk of homelessness that is happening in so many communities across Canada. I'd like to name just a few in my riding: the Campbell River Coalition to End Homelessness, the Grassroots Kind Hearts who feed people in Campbell River every day, the Salvation Army Lighthouse in Port Hardy who provide lunch 5 times a week, the Port Hardy Seniors Society, of which I am a member, who feed seniors lunch every Tuesday and provide many opportunities for activities in the community, the Homelessness Partnering Strategy funded in Port Hardy through the Sacred Wolf Friendship Centre, the Comox Valley Coalition to End Homelessness, Dawn to Dawn in Comox Valley, does so much to support those who are at high risk and homeless. The Community Resource Centre of Powell River, which recently just received 20 beds added to provide emergency shelter. The Powell River Committee Against Homelessness, the Salvation Army that has shelters in several of the communities I represent. And that is just a few of the organizations that work hard every day with people across our communities that are facing significant challenges with housing. I think it's so important that we recognize that in rural, remote parts of Canada, housing is a significant crisis. And the organizations that I mentioned before do everything that they can, but they need a more active partner in the federal government. In BC, we are actually seeing what an active partner looks like. Recently, the Housing Minister of BC made a significant announcement in investments for housing. What I really appreciate is that rather than leaving the majority of the resources at the back end, like this government currently is, with 90% not even beginning to move until the next election, the Housing Minister is making sure that it's in the front. As the Housing Minister said in an announcement about housing crisis in BC, that, quote, "We're front-loading because the situation is so desperate," she said. "It breaks my heart every time I hear a story," and I heard another one today of a community, an Indigenous community, that is reeling from 2 suicide deaths of young people, end quote. This is from an article in the Tyee. I want to be really clear. This government, this provincial BC government, is dedicating funding for 1,100 units of Indigenous housing, both on and off reserve. And you know what? Provinces do not usually fund housing on reserve. Usually, they step out of that and see it as a federal responsibility. But as the article says, on-reserve housing has been a federal responsibility since 1867 and has been chronically underfunded. So when we look at stories like Pat's, we know that there's a significant issue for seniors across this country, and we need to make sure that they don't fall through the cracks. And I want to make sure that today in this House that people understand that seniors simply can't wait. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
I'd like to thank the member opposite for bringing that human story, not just to Parliament, but to all of Canada through Parliament. The challenges facing communities across this country as it relates to homelessness, but housing and homelessness are partnered in this challenge, are profound. And we have done several things to support governments like the BC government and others to try and turn the situation around with an historic investment in housing, which is not just the $40 billion over the next 10 years, but also includes the $5.8 billion put in our first budget, which are the dollars that are being spent by the provincial government in BC so effectively. But more has to be done. And part of what also has to be done is that we have to understand that the story that was just told to us comes from rural Canada. rural Canada has housing and homeless challenges as well. And the previous government, when they identified 61 designated communities, kind of forgot rural Canada and also imposed the rules on rural Canada that they imposed on urban Canada. In other words, the definition of what constituted chronic homelessness was exactly the same as what designated in major cities like Vancouver or Toronto. And the challenge here is that rural communities, especially northern rural communities, experience homelessness differently, and women experience homeless differently, and women in rural communities experience homeless differently, and seniors who are women in rural Canada experience it differently. And the notion that the woman that was just described would have to spend 6 months living on the street before a federal program would even contemplate supporting this individual is obscene. It's wrong. And the changes that we've made to the program allow for the HPS, the Homeless Partnership Money, which is now renamed as Reaching Home, to work in preventative strategies. And one of the things we're trying to get to, and there's a good study coming out of London, Ontario, is the role that hospitals play in projecting people into homelessness. And the right to housing is going to be realized when governmental organizations that provide provisional housing don't simply swing the door open and say, good luck, I hope you find housing out there, but actually have a responsibility before discharge to make sure that people have a place to call home, that their rent is secured, and that they're attached to housing systems that can realize their housing needs and thus respect their human rights. This is the change to Reaching Home. It combines, as I said at the beginning, it is intertwined with an approach to housing, which also is building new housing now. We've built 14,000 units of housing since we took office. We've repaired 156,000 units of housing, and our support has reached into more than 1 million homes across the country. But even though we put these large numbers in play, and even though we invested before the $40 billion and have reprofiled the money in that $40 billion investment, when you hear stories like this, you know you have to work harder, you know you have to deliver more, because no senior, no woman, no person in rural Canada, no person anywhere in Canada should be in the situation where they find themselves paying the sorts of rents that were described, not having the supports around meal and social services and community. That is just unacceptable. And so that National Housing Strategy is a bold new beginning on the housing front. More needs to be done, and we have to make sure that when we act in recognition of the complexity of this issue right across Canada. As for the issue of Indigenous housing, the government is currently engaged with the national Indigenous organizations, the Métis, the Inuit, and the First Nations, and we're also in the groundbreaking moments of a national urban housing strategy to fulfill the last chapter of the National Housing Strategy to make sure all Canadians get the home they deserve. Thank the member for the story that she told. I will assure her that help is on the way, because help has already arrived in places like BC with a good, strong partnership between our government and the provincial government in Victoria.
Member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly do hope that help is on the way, because so many people are falling through terrible cracks. You know, I sat with Pat in her not very warm and friendly hotel, and she talked about how the community around her was doing everything they could to support her and how grateful she was. And I thought to myself, you know, she has a lot more grace than I would have in that circumstance. But it's also about working with women who are in their 80s that are calling my office because they didn't get their taxes done on time because of health issues. And so they've lost their GIS and now are facing eviction. You know, one woman in particular was 86 and she didn't know what she was going to do if she was homeless at that age. Seniors from small communities being sent to large communities to access health care, struggling to find housing, but at the same time, seniors in the larger communities being sent to the smaller communities because they can't afford to live in those bigger communities. And based on the vital signs in my community, we know that we have a lot of seniors, up to 26+% in our communities. Over 40% of renters are spending 30% or more, in some cases 50% in rent, and the vacancy is very, very low. So I look for action, and right now I just have to say, Canadians are waiting and waiting, and they simply cannot wait when they're in these vulnerable circumstances. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, I'm glad to report that for many, many Canadians, the wait is over. The 14,000 new housing units is a start. I agree, we need to do much more. And the National Housing Strategy with the Co-Investment Fund and other investments is poised to do just that. The challenge we have is that it took us 25 years to build the crisis. And our party was part of the problem in the early 90s when we made significant cuts to the housing program. But people like Claudette Bradshaw, who invested her time and energy into changing the course and delivering the HPS, the Homeless Partnership Strategy program, from this side of Parliament. People like John Godfrey, who resuscitated and reinitiated federal investments in housing. And people like Bill Graham, who refused to let the operating agreements expire in cities like Toronto, and in particular for co-ops. All of these Liberal members also helped start to rebuild the system. But quite clearly, by the time I stood for the by-election, the work wasn't near as complete as it should be. This government took office, invested $5.8 billion immediately. Those dollars are the dollars producing houses in places like BC now. We've now reprofiled the dollars to make them more effective. That's the next 10 years with a $40 billion investment with good, strong bilaterals. And I'm proud to say British Columbia was one of the first provinces to sign a bilateral, and that means there's 10 years of runway for housing to be constructed in that province, and that will turn things around, hopefully. If not, we have...
The honour